The judges thought they had seen everything until Ethan Pierce rolled onto that stage. Scarred face, missing left arm, confined to a wheelchair. He looked like a man the world had forgotten. But when his voice filled that auditorium 30 seconds later, for celebrity judges and 2,000 audience members would discover that sometimes God hides the most extraordinary gifts inside the most broken vessels. Ethan Pierce had been a different man 5 years ago. Back then, he was Staff Sergeant Pierce of the 82nd Airborne Division, leading his unit through the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan. His hands, both strong and steady then, had saved lives under enemy fire. Those same hands had held his newborn son Jake for the first time during his last leave, promising his wife Amanda that he'd be home for good after this final deployment. But promises made in war zones are written in sand. The roadside bomb that tore through their convoy on a dusty Tuesday morning didn't just steal Ethan's arm and legs. It stole his identity, his purpose, and for the longest time his will to live. The explosion had thrown him 40 feet from the burning vehicle, leaving him with traumatic brain injury, severe burns across the left side of his face, and damage that would confine him to a wheelchair forever. When Ethan finally woke up in the military hospital in Germany 3 weeks later, the first thing he asked about wasn't his injuries. It was his squad. 7 good men had been in that vehicle. Only 2 made it home alive. The guilt was heavier than any physical pain, while Amanda held his remaining hand and whispered words of gratitude that he was alive. Ethan felt like he had died in that desert. The man she married, the father Jake deserved, the soldier his country had trained, that person was gone. What remained was a broken shell who couldn't even remember how to smile. The first year back in their small hometown of Cedar Falls, Iowa, was a nightmare disguised as recovery. Amanda worked double shifts at the diner to keep their modest house, while neighbors offered help with the kind of pity that made Ethan want to disappear entirely. Little Jake, now 3 years old, would bring him picture books and toy soldiers, not understanding why Daddy couldn't play the way he used to. The darkest moment came on a cold February night when Ethan wheeled himself out the garage, staring at the ropes hanging from the ceiling. The weight of survivor's guilt, the constant phantom pain in his missing limb, and the feeling of being a burden to everyone he loved had pushed him to the edge of a choice no one should have to make. But that night, as snow fell silently outside, Jake wandered into the garage in his pajamas, rubbing sleepy eyes. Without saying a word, the little boy climbed onto his father's lap and curled up against his chest. In that moment, feeling his son's heartbeat against his own, Ethan realized that maybe survival wasn't about returning to who he used to be. Maybe it was about discovering who he could still become. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with small things, helping Jake with coloring books using his right hand, learning to navigate the house without feeling like a stranger in his own home. Amanda suggested he try the veteran support group at the community center, but Ethan resisted. He wasn't ready to sit in a circle and share feelings with other broken soldiers. Instead, he found solace in an unexpected place. Late at night, when Amanda and Jake were asleep, Ethan would wheel himself to the old piano that had belonged to Amanda's grandmother. The instrument had sat silent in their living room for years, more decoration than musical instrument, but something about those ivory keys called to him in his darkest hours. At first, his right hand could barely manage simple melodies. The muscle memory from childhood piano lessons, buried under years of military training and adult responsibilities, slowly began to surface. He started with basic scales, then simple songs he remembered from church. The music didn't fix anything, but it gave his pain somewhere to go. Months passed, and Ethan's late-night piano sessions became more complex, more emotional. He began writing his own melodies, pouring his grief, his guilt, his love for his fallen brothers into compositions that would have made his high school music teacher weep. But he kept this musical journey private, too afraid to share something so vulnerable with a world that already saw him as damaged. The turning point came when Jake, now 4 and endlessly curious, woke up one night to find his father at the piano. Instead of being startled, the little boy listened in wonder as Ethan played a haunting melody that seemed to capture all the sadness and beauty in the world. When the song ended, Jake whispered, "Daddy." That was like hearing angels talk. For the first time since the explosion, Ethan felt a spark of something that might have been pride, maybe hope, Amanda discovered his musical gift by accident a few weeks later when she came home early from work. She stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face as she listened to her husband play with an intensity and skill she never knew he possessed. When he finished, she walked over and kissed the scarred side of his face, whispering, "The world needs to hear this, Ethan. This is bigger than us." But Ethan wasn't ready. The thought of performing in front of people, of being stared at and judged, terrified him more than any combat mission ever had. He was comfortable in the shadows, playing for an audience of two. The idea of exposing his music, and by extension his pain, to strangers felt like volunteering to be wounded all over again. It was Jake who finally pushed his father into the spotlight, though the 4-year-old had no idea he was doing it. During a family dinner at Amanda's parent house, Jake excitedly told his grandparents about Daddy's angel music. Before Ethan could stop him, the whole family was gathered around the old upright piano, waiting expectantly. With trembling fingers, Ethan began to play. The song that emerged was unlike anything he had ever composed, a melody that started with the chaos and terror that day in Afghanistan, moved through the darkness of his recovery, and somehow found its way to hope. When he finished, his father-in-law, a Vietnam veteran who rarely showed emotion, was wiping tears from his eyes. "Son," the older man said quietly, "I've never heard anything that beautiful, and I've never heard anything that true." Word spread quickly through their small town. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the wounded veteran who had found healing through music. A video of Ethan playing at the community center's Memorial Day ceremony went viral on social media, shared by thousands of people who found hope in his story. That's when the call came from producers of America's Voice, the nation's most popular singing competition. They had seen the video and wanted to know if Ethan would consider auditioning for their show. The opportunity was beyond anything he had imagined, but it terrified him. The show attracted millions of viewers, and the blind audition format meant he would be judged purely on his voice and musical ability, not his appearance or story. Amanda and Jake were enthusiastic supporters, but Ethan wrestled with doubt. What if he failed on national television? What if his story became just another feel-good segment that people forgot about the next day? What if he embarrassed himself and his family in front of the entire country? The decision ultimately came down to a conversation with Tommy Rodriguez, one of his former squad members who had survived the explosion. Tommy visited Cedar Falls specifically to talk sense into his old sergeant. Over beers at the local VFW hall, Tommy laid it out plain. "Sarge, you think you failed us that day in Afghanistan. But what if your real mission was never about that convoy? What if it was always about this moment, right here? What if everything you've been through was preparing you to give hope to people who need it most?" 3 months later, Ethan found himself backstage at the America's Voice studios in Los Angeles, his heart pounding harder than it had during any firefight. Amanda squeezed his hand as production assistants prepared him for his blind audition. The format was simple. 4 celebrity judges would listen to his performance with their backs turned, unable to see him until they decided whether to turn their chairs around and invite him to join their team. As Ethan wheeled himself onto the darkened stage, he could hear the murmur of the audience, feel the heat of the television lights. The judges, country superstar Blake Sullivan, pop icon Jessica Martinez, R&B legend Marcus Williams, and rock goddess Diana Stone, sat with their backs to him, waiting. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him. This was so far outside his comfort zone that he could barely breathe. But then he thought about his brothers who never made it home, about Amanda working double shifts, about Jake's innocent faith in his daddy's angel music. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about honoring everyone who had brought him to this moment. Ethan positioned his right hand over the piano keys and began to play. The melody that emerged was the same one he had composed at night in his garage when Jake had saved his life without knowing it. But now it carried additional weight. The weight of 5 years of healing, of learning to live with loss, of discovering that broken things could still create beauty. Then he began to sing. His voice, untrained but raw with emotion, filled the auditorium with a power that seemed impossible from such a wounded man. The song told the story of a soldier who lost everything, but found something greater in return. It spoke of brotherhood and sacrifice, of guilt and redemption, of learning that survival isn't about staying the same, but about becoming something new. Within 30 seconds, Jessica Martinez hit her button and spun around, her eyes widening as she took in Ethan's appearance and story. Marcus Williams followed 10 seconds later, then Diana Stone. Blake Sullivan held out the longest, but by the time Ethan reached the chorus, all 4 judges had turned their chairs. But something even more remarkable was happening in the audience. 2,000 people were on their feet, many wiping away tears, all of them understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a singing competition. Veterans in the audience saluted. Family members of fallen soldiers held each other. Complete strangers found themselves connected by the universal truth that pain, when transformed through art, becomes a bridge between human hearts. When the last note faded, the auditorium erupted in applause that lasted nearly 5 minutes. The judges struggled to find words adequate to what they had just experienced. Jessica Martinez, known for her composure, was openly weeping. In 15 years of doing this show, she said, I have never heard anything that moved me like that. You didn't just sing to us. You shared your soul. Marcus Williams, the R&B legend who had discovered dozens of major recording artists, was equally emotional. Son, what you just did up there was an audition. It was a ministry. You took your pain and turned it into something that's going to heal people you'll never even meet. All 4 judges wanted Ethan on their team, leading to a friendly competition that was settled when Blake Sullivan shared that his own brother had been killed in Iraq. I understand something about that kind of loss, Blake said quietly, and I know something about how music can help carry that weight. I would be honored to work with you. But the real victory had already happened. In that moment when Ethan's voice filled the auditorium, he had completed a journey that began in a hospital bed 5 years earlier. The man who had once thought his life was over had discovered that sometimes our endings are actually beginnings in disguise. The judges' votes were just confirmation of what everyone in that room already knew. They had witnessed a miracle, not the kind that makes wounds disappear or brings back the dead, but the kind that transforms suffering into something beautiful, something that helps others carry their own burdens a little more easily. As Ethan wheeled off that stage to embrace Amanda and Jake in the wings, he understood something profound about the nature of healing. His scars would never disappear. His brothers would never come home. The phantom pain in his missing limb would probably never fully fade. But none of that mattered anymore, because he had learned the most important lesson of all. We are not defined by what breaks us, but by what we choose to build from the pieces. 6 months later, Ethan Pierce would win America's Voice, but that victory was just the beginning of a larger story. His debut album, dedicated to the memory of his fallen squad mates, would top the country charts and raise millions for wounded veteran organizations. He would perform at the White House, at military bases around the world, and at small-town venues where other wounded warriors needed to hear that their stories weren't over. But perhaps most importantly, he would return to Cedar Falls as a man who had kept his promise after all. He had come home to be the father Jake needed and the husband Amanda deserved. He had learned that heroism isn't always about charging into battle. Sometimes it's about having the courage to share your broken heart with the world and trust that something beautiful will grow from cracks. Because in the end, that's where the light gets in. That's where the music lives. That's where miracles are born from the ashes of what we thought was lost forever.